On the night of June 25, 1906, the roof of Madison Square Garden in New York City was packed for the opening performance of a musical revue called Mam'zelle Champagne. Waiters moved between crowded tables. A chorus line worked through a number called I Could Love a Million Girls. Near the stage sat the architect Stanford White, 52 years old, the man who had designed the very building around them. A few tables away, a thin, restless man in a heavy overcoat watched him. It was late June, and the coat did not suit the weather. Shortly before 11 o'clock, that man crossed the room, raised a revolver to White's face, and fired 3 times. White slumped across the table and did not move again. 900 people watched it happen. The man who fired the shots was Harry Kendall Thaw, heir to a Pittsburgh coal fortune, and the question this case would spend 2 trials trying to answer was not who killed Stanford White. Everyone had seen that. The question was whether Harry Thaw was sane enough to hang for it. Before going further, take a moment to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a case like this one. Now, back to New York. The city in 1906 sat at the height of what would later be called the Gilded Age, a period of extraordinary and visible wealth concentrated in a narrow band of families. Fifth Avenue mansions stood a few blocks from crowded tenements, and the distance between them was not just geography. It was the entire social order of the city, laid bare on a single map. Newspapers fought each other for readers with a ferocity that shaped how crimes were reported almost as much as how they were committed. William Randolph Hearst's papers competed against Joseph Pulitzer's, and both competed against the more restrained New York Times, each racing to put its own version of a story on the street first. A murder involving a famous architect, a chorus girl, and a coal heir was, for these papers, the story of a generation, and they would treat it as exactly that for the better part of 2 years. Madison Square Garden itself stood at Madison Avenue and 26th Street. It was the second building to carry that name, completed in 1890, designed by the firm McKim, Mead & White. The building was Moorish in style, topped by a tower and a nude statue of the goddess Diana by the sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens. On its roof sat a garden theater, used for light cabaret-style entertainment through the summer months, drawing a fashionable crowd out of the heat of the streets below. It was, in a very direct sense, a monument to Stanford White's own career, one landmark among a body of work that also included the Washington Square Arch, the Herald Building, and country houses for some of the wealthiest families in the country. It was inside that monument, on a stage he himself had conceived, that White would die. New York's criminal courts of the period ran differently from a modern courtroom. Felony trials in Manhattan were heard in the Court of General Sessions, prosecuted by the Office of the New York County District Attorney. Forensic science, as it would later be understood, barely existed. There was no ballistics matching in the modern sense, no blood typing used in court, no fingerprint bureau of any real sophistication in New York at that time. Investigators and juries relied on eyewitness testimony, and increasingly in this period, on the evolving field of psychiatry, then called alienism, a discipline still finding its footing in American courtrooms. In the Thaw case, there was no mystery about who fired the gun. Hundreds of witnesses had seen it. The entire legal battle to come would be fought over a single question: what was happening inside Harry Thaw's mind? Stanford White was born in New York City on November 9, 1853. By 1906, he was a partner in McKim, Mead & White, the most prominent architectural firm in the country. He had designed Madison Square Garden, the Washington Square Arch, the Herald Building, the Judson Memorial Church, and a long list of mansions and country estates for the era's wealthiest families. He had helped shape the look of Gilded Age New York. He was married to Bessie Springs Smith, and the couple had one son, Lawrence Grant White. Publicly, White was one of the most respected men in the city. Privately, among his own social circle, he had a different reputation. He was known for pursuing young chorus girls and artists' models, and he kept an apartment at 22 West 24th Street fitted out for private parties, with mirrored walls and a red velvet swing. Harry Kendall Thaw was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania on February 12, 1871. His father, William Thaw Sr., had built a fortune in coal and railroads, reported at the time to be worth around $40 million. When the elder Thaw died in 1889, Harry inherited a trust that reportedly paid him somewhere between $80,000 and $200,000 a year, an enormous income for the period. The trust was controlled in part by his mother, Mary Copley Thaw, because of long-standing concerns about her son's stability. Harry had been sent down from, or had withdrawn from, both the Western University of Pennsylvania and Harvard, without finishing a degree at either. His behavior before 1906 was already a matter of record among people who knew him. In 1902, in Paris, he was widely reported to have horsewhipped a young man in a public dispute. New York police were familiar with him for harassing chorus girls around the theater district. Several witnesses would later testify that he used cocaine. Evelyn Nesbit was born on December 25, 1884, in Tarentum, Pennsylvania, though some contemporary sources gave a slightly later year. By the time she was 15 or 16, she was working as an artist's model in New York, her face used by the illustrator Charles Dana Gibson, among others, and she had joined the chorus of Broadway productions including Florodora. Around 1901, when she was about 16, she met Stanford White, then in his late 40s. White became her patron. According to Nesbit's own later testimony, he also became, at his apartment on West 24th Street, the man who drugged and assaulted her. That account was never independently proven in a court of law. It came from her, under oath, years after the fact, and it was contested at the time as testimony shaped by the defense's need for a sympathetic narrative. It is presented here as her account, not as an adjudicated fact. Around 1903, Nesbit met Harry Thaw. He pursued her with a persistence that struck those around them as extreme, even by the standards of a wealthy suitor. He showered her with gifts. He arranged travel. That same year, on a trip through Europe, the two rented a castle in the Tyrol region of Austria called Schloss Katzenstein. According to Nesbit's later testimony, it was there that she told Thaw about her history with White, and it was there that Thaw beat her severely. That beating, as she described it in court, would later become a central pillar of Thaw's defense, recast not as an act of violence against his future wife, but as evidence of a wound to his mind that had never fully healed. Despite this, and despite the objections of Thaw's mother, Harry Thaw and Evelyn Nesbit were married in Pittsburgh on April 4, 1905. Mary Copley Thaw reportedly relented only after negotiating a financial settlement involving Nesbit. Over the following year, by multiple later accounts, Thaw grew increasingly fixated on Stanford White. He was reported to have hired private detectives to follow him. He confronted acquaintances with questions about White's reputation and his past dealings with young women. Multiple witnesses would later testify that in the months before June 1906, Thaw had made repeated and specific threats against White's life. If you are finding this as chilling as it was at the time, consider a like and a subscribe. It helps us keep uncovering these forgotten cases. Now, back to the record. On the evening of June 25, 1906, Thaw and Nesbit dined with a couple named Truxton Beale before heading to the roof of Madison Square Garden for the opening night of Mam'selle Champagne. Stanford White arrived separately and took a table near the stage, close to where the performance would unfold, a spot he was known to favor when he came to the roof theater. Witnesses in the room later testified that Thaw did not sit still. He moved through the crowd for much of the evening, circling tables, still wearing his heavy overcoat in the June heat, drawing the kind of notice a man in a winter coat draws in summer without anyone yet knowing why. No one who noticed him that night understood, in the moment, what they were watching take shape. Shortly before 11 o'clock, the chorus reached the finale number, "I Could Love a Million Girls." The tables were close together, and the room was warm with gaslight and bodies, waiters still moving between courses as the number built toward its close. Thaw approached White's table from behind. He raised the revolver, a .32 caliber pistol by most accounts, and fired 3 times into White's face at close range. White did not rise from his chair. He fell forward across the table and was dead before anyone reached him. Some early confused newspaper reports described 4 shots. Later, more careful accounts settled on 3, and 3 is the figure generally accepted today. For those first few seconds, the music did not even stop. The The report of the pistol was close enough to the rhythm of the number that it took the room a moment to separate gunfire from performance. For a moment, the room did not understand what it had heard. Some in the audience thought the shots were part of the show, a stage effect timed to the music. The orchestra faltered and stopped. Then the screaming started, and the illusion broke. Thaw made no move to run. He stood near the table holding the revolver at his side while the crowd around him surged back in horror. A stage manager reportedly called out to the crowd that a stray effect had gone wrong, trying for a few seconds to hold off the panic before the truth of what had happened became plain to everyone in the room. Within moments, a fireman working the venue, identified in most accounts only as a man named Paul or Paulson, though the record is inconsistent on his exact name, grabbed Thaw and wrestled the revolver from his hand. Thaw did not resist. He was calm, almost businesslike, as uniformed officers arrived to take him into custody. Evelyn Nesbit, who had been elsewhere in the room when the shots were fired, was brought to her husband's side within minutes before he was led away. What Thaw said in the immediate aftermath would matter enormously to both sides in the trials to come. To a young chorus girl standing nearby, he reportedly said, "I have probably saved your life." To police, he gave an account that included the words that he had shot White because he ruined my wife. These were not the words of a man in the grip of blind, unthinking violence. They were composed, specific, and aimed at justification, and the prosecution would return to them again and again as proof that Thaw understood exactly what he had done. There was no concealment to unravel and no fugitive to chase. Roughly 900 people had watched Stanford White die in a building he himself had designed during a musical number about love. The investigation that followed did not need to establish who had fired the gun. It needed to establish what state of mind had been behind the finger on the trigger, and whether that state of mind was enough, under the law, to excuse a killing carried out in front of a packed theater. Police took statements from dozens of witnesses in the room that night, waiters, cast members, and patrons seated near both tables, building a record of exactly what had been seen and heard in the minutes before the shooting. Detectives worked table by table while the theater was still being cleared, taking names and brief accounts before the crowd dispersed into the streets around Madison Square. The coroner's office took charge of White's body. There was little dispute over the physical cause of death. He'd been shot in the head at close range and had died almost instantly. No exhumation, no laboratory test, and no forensic puzzle stood between investigators and the fact of the killing. The entire weight of the case shifted instead onto two competing efforts, one built by the defense and one by the prosecution, to explain what had been happening inside Harry Thaw's mind in the months and years before he pulled the trigger. Thaw's family, led by his mother Mary Copley Thaw, began assembling a case for hereditary and personal instability almost immediately. Investigators working for the defense gathered accounts of an uncle who had been institutionalized, of alleged childhood head injuries, and of a long pattern of violent or erratic outbursts stretching back years before the Garden shooting, including the 1902 horsewhipping incident in Paris and the 1903 beating at Schloss Katzenstein. Detectives and lawyers working for the family interviewed acquaintances in Pittsburgh and New York, building a file meant to show that Thaw's mind had been unsound long before he ever raised a gun. It was a large and expensive undertaking, run out of the family's own resources rather than through any official channel, and it would shape the entire defense strategy that followed. District Attorney William Travers Jerome built the opposing case. Jerome's investigators focused on Thaw's behavior in the direct lead-up to the murder, gathering testimony from witnesses who described him hiring private detectives to trail White for months, and from acquaintances who said Thaw had spoken openly and repeatedly of wanting White dead. Jerome's team also collected evidence of Thaw's composure in the minutes after the shooting. His calm surrender of the weapon, his measured statements to police and bystanders, as proof that whatever drove him to kill, it had not deprived him of reason or self-control at the moment it mattered. Between the two files, defense and prosecution, lay the entire case that would eventually go before two separate juries, not a dispute over facts, but a dispute over what those facts meant. Thaw was held without bail at the Tombs, the Manhattan House of Detention, from the night of the shooting. A coroner's inquest followed within days, and a New York County grand jury indicted him for first-degree murder in July of 1906. Because there was no factual question about who had fired the shots, the pretrial period turned almost entirely into a contest over strategy. Mary Copley Thaw retained and then dismissed a series of attorneys as she and her son's lawyers argued over which defense to mount. One faction pushed for a straightforward insanity plea, built on the medical history the investigators had assembled. Another pushed for an appeal to what was popularly called the unwritten law, the argument that a husband who killed the man who had wronged his wife deserved sympathy rather than the gallows. The disagreement dragged on for months, delaying the start of the trial and drawing its own stream of newspaper coverage. Each shift in counsel reported as a fresh sign of a family divided over how far to go in publicly airing Evelyn Nesbit's history, before the first trial finally opened in January of 1907. The first trial began on January 23, 1907, in the Court of General Sessions, with Justice James Fitzgerald presiding and William Travers Jerome again prosecuting. The defense at this stage tried to blend both strategies, presenting Thaw simultaneously as a wronged husband and as a man of unsound mind. At the center of the proceedings was Evelyn Nesbit. Over several days on the witness stand, in testimony the press would come to call her "poor little butterfly" narrative. She gave a detailed account of her history with Stanford White, beginning with their meeting when she was about 16. She described the apartment on West 24th Street, the mirrored room, and the red velvet swing. She described a night, she said, when White had given her drugged champagne and assaulted her while she was unconscious. She went on to describe the confrontation at Schloss Katzenstein in Austria, when Thaw learned of her history with White and beat her in response. Her testimony, delivered in explicit detail for a courtroom of that era, dominated the newspapers covering the trial, and it served two purposes at once. It built sympathy for Thaw as a man avenging his wife, and it supported the formal claim that the strain of learning what had happened to her had broken his mind. The defense called psychiatric witnesses, among them Dr. Britton D. Evans, who testified that Thaw suffered from a degenerative hereditary mental disorder and had been legally insane at the moment he fired the gun. The precise diagnostic language used by these witnesses varied from one account to another in the press and should be treated as imprecisely reported rather than settled medical fact. The prosecution answered with its own alienists, who testified that Thaw was sane. Jerome cross-examined the defense's psychiatric witnesses aggressively and at one point read aloud at length a long and rambling letter Thaw had written, arguing that its contents showed calculation rather than madness. Jerome also returned repeatedly to Thaw's composed behavior in the minutes after the shooting, the surrendered weapon, the measured statements to police, as evidence that whatever had driven him to kill, it had not robbed him of reason. The jury deliberated for an extended period before reporting on April 12, 1907, that it could not reach a verdict. 7 jurors reportedly favored a conviction for first-degree murder. 5 favored acquittal on grounds of insanity. Justice Fitzgerald declared a mistrial, and the case that had already consumed the city for the better part of a year was set to begin again from the start. Second trial opened in January of 1908 in the same Court of General Sessions, with Justice Victor J. Dowling presiding and Jerome again prosecuting for the county. Thaw's defense had been reorganized around a new lead attorney, the California lawyer Delphin Delmas, known in the press as the Napoleon of the California bar. Delmas discarded the blended strategy of the first trial and narrowed the defense to a single, cleaner theory. He called it dementia americana. It was not a recognized medical diagnosis. It was a phrase of Delmas's own devising, a legal and rhetorical argument that any American man could be seized by a temporary, exculpatory madness upon learning that his wife's honor had been violated. Where the first trial had tried to prove Thaw permanently and hereditarily unsound, Delmas argued only that Thaw had been temporarily insane in the specific moment he fired the gun, a narrower and, to this jury, a more persuasive claim. Evelyn Nesbit took the stand again and repeated the same core account she had given at the first trial, her history with White and the confrontation at Schloss Katzenstein. The defense again called psychiatric witnesses to support the narrower claim of temporary insanity at the instant of the shooting, rather than a lifelong condition. Jerome again contested Thaw's sanity, presenting much of the same evidence of composure and premeditation he had used in 1907. But the jury in this second trial proved more receptive to Delmas's narrowed theory than the first jury had been to the broader one. On February 1, 1908, the jury returned its verdict. Harry Thaw was found not guilty by reason of insanity. Under New York law at the time, that verdict did not mean freedom. A finding of not guilty by reason of insanity required automatic commitment, and the court ordered Thaw confined to the Mattawan State Hospital for the criminally insane in Fishkill, New York. The man who had shot Stanford White in front of 900 witnesses would not hang, and he would not walk free. He would be locked away instead, in an institution built for men the law had decided were too unsound to be held responsible for what they had done. Thaw arrived at Mattawan in February of 1908, and he did not accept his confinement quietly. Over the following years, he petitioned the courts repeatedly, arguing through his lawyers that he had recovered his sanity and no longer belonged in an institution for the criminally insane. Jerome, still in office, contested each petition, and the state resisted his release at every turn. For 5 years, the case that had already produced 2 trials produced a slower, quieter third contest, fought in hearing rooms rather than in front of a jury of 12. On August 17, 1913, Thaw escaped from Mattawan. He crossed the border into Canada before authorities caught up with him, and he was eventually recaptured and extradited back to the United States, an ordeal that reopened the legal fight over his custody all over again. 2 more years passed in hearings and appeals. Finally, on July 16, 1915, a jury found Harry Thaw sane. He was released. Evelyn Nesbit's marriage to Thaw did not survive his years at Mattawan or his return to freedom. She divorced him, with the final decree generally placed around 1916. Her life afterward was unsettled. She worked intermittently in vaudeville and later in film, struggled with money and with dependency on alcohol and drugs, and in later years published her own memoirs, setting out her account of the White killing and the trials that followed it, the same account she had given from the witness stand years before. Freedom did not last long for Thaw without incident. In 1917, he was arrested again, this time for horsewhipping a teenage boy named Frederick Gump in Long Beach, New York. The attack echoed the horsewhipping he had been accused of in Paris more than a decade earlier, and it triggered a fresh sanity hearing. Thaw was again committed, and he remained under institutional care for several more years before he was finally released in 1924, this time for good. He lived another 2 decades outside any institution, largely out of the newspapers that had once been unable to get enough of him, until he died in Miami, Florida on February 22, 1947, at the age of 76. The building where it happened did not last much longer than the case itself. The second Madison Square Garden, the rooftop theater where Stanford White died beneath his own design, was demolished in 1925, not 2 decades after the shooting. McKim, Mead & White continued on as a firm after his death, and its other surviving work, the Washington Square Arch, the Judson Memorial Church, the mansions and country houses White had designed for New York's wealthiest families, remained standing across the city and beyond it, a body of work that outlasted both the man who created it and the building where his life ended. The battle over Thaw's sanity had never come cheap. In the earliest months after the shooting, before Delmas took command of the defense, the family's lead counsel was a New York attorney named Clifford Hartridge, one of several lawyers who cycled through the case as Mary Copley Thaw weighed which strategy to pursue. Contemporary estimates placed her total spending on her son's defense across the grand jury proceedings in both trials at more than $1 million, a sum drawn from the same coal and railroad fortune that had made Harry Thaw one of the wealthiest young men in the country. It was that money, as much as any argument made in court, that kept the case alive across 2 full trials and years of appeals, rather than ending in a single quick proceeding. At the second trial, the prosecution's psychiatric case rested heavily on the testimony of Dr. Charles Wagner, an alienist from Binghamton State Hospital who examined Thaw on behalf of the state and told the jury he found him legally sane, capable of telling right from wrong both before and at the moment he fired the revolver. Wagner's testimony sat directly against the defense's medical witnesses, and the jury was left to weigh one set of professional opinions against another, with no forensic evidence of any kind to settle the disagreement. It was psychiatry against psychiatry, dressed in the language of medicine but shaped on both sides by which side had called the witness to the stand. The courtroom itself, through both trials, was a crowded and physically uncomfortable place. Spectators packed the public benches from the opening gavel each morning, straining for a view of Nesbit or of Thaw himself, and extra police were posted at the doors to manage the crowds that gathered outside the Court of General Sessions on the morning's testimony was expected. Reporters filled entire rows, filing updates by the hour for papers that ran the trial as a running serial, complete with courtroom sketches, since photography was not permitted inside. Jerome cut a sharp figure at the prosecution table, known for his combative cross-examinations, and it was in that packed, close room that he staged his reading of Thaw's letter, using the defendant's own words, delivered aloud line by line before the jury, to argue that a man capable of writing at such length and with such purpose was not a man who had lost his reason. The rooftop where Stanford White died is gone now. The building he designed came down in 1925, and the theater where 900 people watched him fall across a table during a song about love exists today only in newspaper columns and courtroom transcripts. What survives is the record of two trials that turned a plain question, who fired the gun, into a far harder one. What does it mean for a wealthy man to be too unsound to hang and too dangerous to walk free? Harry Thaw answered that question with his family's fortune and Delphine Delmas's careful phrase, dementia americana, and the law of the time accepted it. Stanford White never got to answer at all. If you want to hear another forgotten case like this one, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and leave a comment with the case you would like covered next.